The year was 180 CE, and the morning mist clung to the Danube River like the breath of dying gods. Along the muddied banks of this northern frontier, the greatest empire the world had ever known was slowly bleeding to death. In a leather campaign tent, surrounded by the sounds of a restless army and the distant howls of Germanic tribes, sat a man who would become history's most unlikely warrior philosopher. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, Emperor of Rome, pressed his withered fingers against his temples as he reviewed the latest dispatches from the Marcomannic Wars. At 59, his once golden hair had turned silver, and deep lines carved by years of responsibility etched his noble features. The purple cloak of imperial authority hung heavy on his shoulders, but it was nothing compared to the weight of his thoughts. "Caesar," his aide-de-camp Avidius Cassius whispered, entering the tent with the reverence reserved for gods and emperors. "The Germanic chieftains have rejected our latest peace overture. They demand we withdraw behind the Alps." Marcus looked up from his leather-bound journal, where he had been writing his private thoughts, meditations that would one day be read by millions. His dark eyes, though tired, still held the fire of a man who had spent his life trying to understand the nature of virtue, duty, and human suffering. "They mistake our desire for peace as weakness," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man who had learned to speak with the authority of absolute power while maintaining the humility of a student of philosophy. "But we are not here merely to conquer, Cassius. We are here to bring order to chaos, to extend the blessing of Roman law to those who know only the brutality of tribal warfare." Outside, the camp was stirring to life. The 14th Gemina Legion was preparing for another day of brutal frontier warfare against the Marcomanni and Quadi tribes. These Germanic peoples, pushed westward by even more fearsome tribes from the steppes, had crossed the Danube in unprecedented numbers. For the first time in centuries, barbarian armies had actually breached Italy itself, reaching as far as Aquileia before being repelled. Marcus rose from his camp chair, his joints protesting after years of campaign life. This was not the life he had imagined when, as a young man, he had studied under the great Stoic teachers of his day. He had dreamed of a life spent in quiet contemplation, writing philosophy, and governing justly from the marble halls of Rome. Instead, he had spent the last decade of his reign in these frontier camps, fighting an endless series of wars against tribes whose names most Romans couldn't even pronounce. The irony was not lost on him. Here was a man who had written extensively about the futility of anger and the importance of accepting fate with equanimity. Yet he was locked in a struggle that would define the future of civilization itself. The Stoic philosophy that had shaped his worldview taught that external circumstances were beyond one's control. Only one's response to them mattered. "Summon the legionary commanders," Marcus commanded, his voice taking on the steel that had commanded respect from Germania to Britain. "We march at dawn." As the sun climbed higher, revealing the vast encampment that housed nearly 100,000 Roman soldiers, Marcus walked among his men. These were not the pampered praetorians of Rome, but hardened veterans of the northern frontier. Their faces bore the scars of countless skirmishes. Their armor was dented and weather-beaten, and their eyes held the steady gaze of men who had looked death in the face and lived to tell about it. The Germanic tribes they faced were formidable opponents. The Marcomanni, led by their king Balamar, were skilled warriors who had learned much from their previous encounters with Roman legions. They had abandoned their traditional tactics of wild charges in favor of more sophisticated strategies that exploited the difficult terrain of the Danube basin. But Marcus had something his enemies lacked: the disciplined war machine of the Roman Empire. Each legion was a perfectly coordinated instrument of destruction, capable of building fortifications, siege engines, and conducting complex maneuvers that no tribal army could match. More importantly, they were led by an emperor who understood that true victory came not from conquest, but from the application of justice and reason. The campaign that followed would test every principle Marcus had ever held dear, As his legions crossed the Danube, they encountered a landscape of burned villages and abandoned settlements. The Germanic tribes had adopted a scorched earth policy, destroying everything that might be useful to the advancing Romans while retreating deeper into the dense forests of their homeland. Marcus established his headquarters at Carnuntum, a fortress city that commanded the vital crossing point of the Danube. From here, he could coordinate the complex logistics required to maintain his armies in hostile territory while keeping open the supply lines that stretched back to Italy. But more than that, Carnuntum became a symbol of Roman civilization planted in the heart of barbarian territory. The emperor's daily routine in the field was a study in contrast. By day he was Caesar, reviewing battle plans, meeting with tribal ambassadors, and making the life and death decisions that would affect millions of people. By night, he was Marcus the philosopher, writing in his journal and contemplating the eternal questions that had fascinated him since youth. "Death smiles at us all," he wrote by candlelight in his tent after a particularly brutal day of fighting. "All a man can do is smile back." These words, written in the midst of a war that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives, captured the essence of the Stoic philosophy that sustained him through his darkest hours. The turning point came during the Battle of the Granuocum River, where Marcus faced the largest Germanic army ever assembled. King Balamar had united dozens of tribes under his leadership, creating a confederation that numbered over 200,000 warriors. The very survival of the Roman Empire seemed to hang in the balance. Marcus stood before his assembled legions as the morning mist revealed the vast barbarian host arrayed across the valley. His speech that day would be remembered by historians as one of the finest examples of Roman oratory, but those who heard it remembered not just the words, but the quiet confidence of a man who had found peace with his fate. "Today we fight not for glory or conquest," he declared, his voice carrying across the ranks of armored legionaries. "We fight for the idea that reason can triumph over chaos, that law can prevail over barbarism, that the light of civilization can push back the darkness of ignorance. Each of you carries within your heart the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of Roman achievement. Let that light shine forth today." The battle that followed was a masterpiece of Roman military engineering and tactics. Marcus had chosen his ground carefully, forcing the Germanic tribes to attack across a river while his legions held the high ground. The famous testudo formation, soldiers locked together behind their shields like the Shalaba tortoise, proved devastatingly effective against the barbarian charge. But it was not just superior tactics that won the day. It was the moral authority of an emperor who had proven that he would share the dangers of his men. Marcus fought in the front ranks, his philosophical training having taught him that a true leader must be willing to sacrifice everything for the good of those he served. The victory at Granuocum broke the back of the Germanic Confederation. King Balamar was killed in the fighting, and the surviving tribes sued for peace. Marcus could have pursued them into the depths of Germania, potentially expanding the empire's borders to the Baltic Sea. Instead, he chose a different path, one that reflected his philosophical understanding of the nature of true victory. Rather than seeking to enslave or destroy his enemies, Marcus offered them integration into the Roman system. Germanic warriors were recruited into the Roman army, their skills and knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable in future campaigns. Tribal leaders were given positions in the imperial administration, their authority legitimized by Roman law rather than tribal tradition. This policy of integration rather than domination was revolutionary. Previous Roman emperors had sought to expand the empire's borders through conquest and colonization. Marcus understood that true strength came not from the size of one's territory, but from the loyalty and productivity of one's people. The final years of Marcus's reign were spent consolidating these gains and establishing the administrative structures that would govern the new territories. He personally oversaw the construction of new roads, the establishment of Roman law courts, and the creation of schools where Germanic children could learn Latin and Greek alongside their native languages. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus used these years to complete his philosophical masterwork, a collection of personal reflections that would become known as the Meditations. Written in the quiet hours between campaigns, these thoughts provide an intimate glimpse into the mind of a man struggling to reconcile the demands of absolute power with the pursuit of virtue. "Very little is needed to make a happy life," he wrote during his final winter on the Danube. "It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." These words, written by a man who commanded the loyalty of millions and controlled wealth beyond imagination, reveal the true source of his strength. Marcus Aurelius died on March 17, 180 CE, in his tent at Vindobona, surrounded by his closest advisors, and the leather-bound journal that contained his deepest thoughts. His final words, according to those present, were a quotation from his beloved Stoic philosophy. "Life is like a play. It's not the length, but the excellence of the acting that matters." The emperor's death marked the end of what historians would later call the Pax Romana, the golden age of Roman peace and prosperity. His son Commodus, who inherited the throne, lacked his father's philosophical temperament and moral authority. The empire would survive for several more centuries, but it would never again be guided by a ruler who combined absolute power with such profound wisdom. The legacy of Marcus Aurelius extends far beyond his military victories or administrative reforms. He proved that it was possible to wield enormous power while maintaining one's humanity, to make life and death decisions while never losing sight of the eternal questions that define human existence. His meditations continue to inspire leaders and thinkers around the world, a testament to the enduring power of ideas born in the muddy camps of the Danube frontier. What would you have done in Marcus's place? Faced with the choice between expansion and consolidation, between conquest and integration, would you have chosen the path of the warrior or the philosopher? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The year was 1428, and France was dying. For nearly a century, the 100 Years' War had raged across the countryside, turning once fertile fields into graveyards and proud cities into smoking ruins. The English, with their deadly longbows and superior tactics, had shattered the flower of French chivalry at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. Now, as winter settled over the besieged city of Orleans, it seemed that the ancient kingdom of France was about to breathe its last. In the small village of Domremy, nestled in the rolling hills of the Lorraine region, a 17-year-old peasant girl named Jeanne d'Arc knelt in the stone chapel of Saint-Remy. Her calloused hands, roughened by years of tending sheep and working in her father's fields, were clasped in prayer as she stared at the wooden crucifix above the altar. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on her weathered face, highlighting the determined set of her jaw and the unwavering faith that blazed in her dark eyes. "Blessed Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that rattled the chapel's ancient windows. "Saint Margaret, Saint Catherine, show me the way." For 3 years, Jeanne had been hearing voices, not the ravings of madness but clear, authoritative commands that came to her with the force of divine revelation. The Archangel Michael, patron saint of France, had appeared to her in a blaze of heavenly light, accompanied by Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine. Their message was simple but earth-shaking. She, a humble peasant girl, was chosen by God to drive the English from French soil and see the Dauphin Charles crowned as the rightful king of France. The very idea was absurd. What could a teenage girl from an obscure village possibly do against the military might of England? The English controlled most of northern France. Their armies were commanded by experienced veterans, and their siege of Orleans had brought the French to the brink of total collapse. The Dauphin Charles, rightful heir to the French throne, was a weak and vacillating young man who had never even been properly crowned, earning him the mocking title of King of Burges from his enemies. But Jeanne had seen visions that transcended earthly logic. She had witnessed the Archangel Michael in his golden armor, his sword blazing with divine fire. She had heard the gentle voices of Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine, urging her to take up arms for the salvation of France. Most importantly, she had been given a sacred mission that burned in her heart like a holy flame. Rising from her knees, Jehanne made her way through the snow-covered streets of Domremy to her family's modest stone house. Inside, the warmth of the central hearth contrasted sharply with the cold reception she knew awaited her. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was a prosperous farmer by village standards, but he was also a practical man who had little patience for his daughter's religious enthusiasms. "Father," Jehanne announced as she entered the main room, where her family was gathered around the fire, "I must go to Vaucouleurs. The voices have commanded it." Jacques looked up from the piece of leather he was mending, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Daughter, enough of this madness. The English are everywhere. The roads are filled with brigands and soldiers. You will stay here where it's safe." But Jehanne's mother, Isabel, saw something in her daughter's eyes that made her pause. This was not the willful stubbornness of youth, but something deeper, a sense of purpose that seemed to emanate from the very core of her being. "What do the voices tell you to do?" Isabel asked quietly. "They tell me to go to the Dauphin," Jehanne replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "I must convince him to give me an army so that I can lift the siege of Orleans and see him crowned at Reims Cathedral, as is his right." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant howling of wolves in the forest. Finally, Jacques spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of a father's love and fear. "You are but a girl, Jehanne. You know nothing of war or politics. The great lords of the realm have failed to save France. What makes you think you can succeed where they have failed?" Jehanne's response would echo through the centuries. "I must do this because God has commanded it. I would rather stay home and spin wool with my mother, but I have no choice. The Lord has work for me to do." The journey to Vaucouleurs, where the royal garrison was commanded by Robert de Baudricourt, was the first test of Jehanne's resolve. Accompanied by her uncle Durand Lassois, she traveled through a countryside devastated by decades of warfare. Burned villages, abandoned farms, and the occasional pile of bones beside the road testified to the human cost of the 100 Years' War. Vaucouleurs itself was a fortified town that had managed to remain loyal to the French crown, but its walls bore the scars of multiple sieges. Captain Baudricourt, a grizzled veteran of countless campaigns, was initially skeptical of the young peasant girl who claimed to have divine visions. The very notion that God would choose a teenage girl to save France struck him as either heretical or insane. "Return this girl to her father," he told Durand Lassois after their first meeting. "She needs a good thrashing to cure her of these delusions." But Jehanne was not deterred. She took lodging in the town and began speaking to anyone who would listen about her divine mission. Her sincerity, combined with her detailed knowledge of military affairs that seemed impossible for a peasant girl to possess, gradually won over some of the townspeople. Word of her prophecies began to spread, and when several of her predictions about military defeats proved accurate, even the skeptical Baudricourt began to take notice. The turning point came when Jehanne accurately predicted a major French defeat at the Battle of Rouvray, also known as the Battle of the Herrings. Distinguished victory, achieved through the use of improvised fortifications made from herring barrels, sent shockwaves through the French court and convinced many that the kingdom was indeed on the brink of destruction. More importantly, Jehanne's description of the battle reached Baudricourt before any official messenger arrived. When asked how she could know such details, she simply replied, "My voices told me." Faced with this inexplicable demonstration of supernatural knowledge, Baudricourt finally agreed to provide Jehanne with an escort to the royal court at Chinon. The journey across war-torn France was perilous, requiring the party to travel by night and avoid the main roads where English patrols were active. Jehanne, dressed in men's clothing for protection, displayed a courage and determination that impressed even the hardened soldiers assigned to guard her. The court at Chinon was a study in contrasts. While France burned, the nobles engaged in elaborate ceremonies and political intrigues that seemed divorced from the reality of impending defeat. The Dauphin Charles, a thin and nervous young man with a weak chin and darting eyes, was more interested in astrology and court gossip than in military affairs. When Jehanne was finally granted an audience, Charles decided to test her by disguising himself as a courtier while one of his nobles sat on the throne. According to the witnesses present, Jehanne immediately identified the true Dauphin despite never having seen him before. Even more remarkably, she spoke to him privately and revealed knowledge of his most secret doubts and fears, doubts about his own legitimacy that he had never shared with anyone. "Gentle Dauphin," she said, kneeling before him in the castle's great hall, "I am Jehanne the maid, sent by God to help you and your kingdom. Give me soldiers, and I will raise the siege of Orleans and lead you to Reims to be crowned as the rightful king of France." Charles, despite his weak character, was not entirely stupid. He ordered a theological examination of Jehanne to determine whether her visions were divine or demonic in origin. For 3 weeks, learned clerics questioned her about her beliefs, her visions, and her understanding of church doctrine. Their conclusion was cautiously positive. They could find no evidence of heresy or demonic influence in her words. More practically, Charles also ordered an investigation into Jehanne's background and moral character. The investigators who traveled to Domremy found that she was universally regarded as a pious and virtuous young woman who had shown unusual devotion to the church from an early age. Her virginity, considered essential for someone claiming divine inspiration, was verified by a panel of noble ladies. Finally convinced, Charles agreed to give Jehanne a small army and the equipment she needed for her mission. The suit of white armor made especially for her became legendary, as did the sword she claimed to have been guided to find buried behind the altar of the chapel of Saint Catherine de Fierbois. The transformation of Jehanne from peasant girl to military commander was remarkable. Despite having no formal training in warfare, she demonstrated an intuitive understanding of tactics and strategy that amazed professional soldiers. Her banner, bearing the image of Christ and the words Jesus Maria, became a rallying point for French forces that had been demoralized by decades of defeat. The siege of Orleans had lasted nearly 7 months when Jehanne arrived with her relief force in April 1429. The city, strategically located on the Loire River, was the key to central France. If it fell, the road to the southern French strongholds would be open, and the complete English conquest of France would be virtually assured. The English siege works were formidable. A series of fortified positions called boulevards surrounded the city and prevented supplies from reaching the defenders. The English commander, the Earl of Salisbury, had been killed by a cannon shot earlier in the siege, but his replacement, the Earl of Suffolk, was an experienced veteran who had no intention of abandoning the investment. Jehanne's arrival changed everything. Her presence alone was enough to revitalize the French defenders, who saw her as a sign that God had not abandoned France. But it was her military acumen that truly made the difference. She correctly identified the weakest points in the English siege lines and convinced the French commanders to adopt more aggressive tactics. The assault on the fortress of Les Tourelles, which guarded the bridge approach to Orleans, became the stuff of legend. Jehanne herself led the attack, her white armor gleaming in the morning sun as she climbed the scaling ladders. When an English arrow pierced her shoulder, she pulled it out herself and continued fighting until the fortress fell. The lifting of the siege of Orleans was the first major French victory in decades. News of the triumph spread throughout France like wildfire, and Jehanne's reputation as a divinely inspired savior grew with each telling. The English, who had seemed invincible, suddenly appeared vulnerable. But Jehanne's greatest victory was yet to come. True to her promise, she led the Dauphin Charles to Reims Cathedral, where he was crowned King Charles VII of France in a ceremony that legitimized his rule and united the French nobility behind him. The sight of the Maid of Orleans standing beside the newly crowned king, her banner held high, symbolized the rebirth of French national identity. The war was far from over, but the balance had shifted. Jehanne's victories had proven that the English could be defeated, and her example inspired a new generation of French commanders to adopt more aggressive tactics. The long process of driving the English from French soil had begun. Tragically, Jehanne's own story would end in betrayal and martyrdom. Captured by Burgundian allies of the English and sold to her enemies, she was put on trial for heresy and witchcraft. The trial, held in Rouen, was a mockery of justice designed to discredit her achievements by painting her as a servant of the devil. On May 30, 1431, Jehanne d'Arc was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She was 19 years old. Her last words, according to witnesses, were "Jesus," repeated over and over as the flames consumed her. Even some of her English captors were moved to tears by her courage and faith. But death could not diminish Jehanne's legacy. Her victories had awakened a sense of French nationalism that would ultimately drive the English from all their continental possessions except Calais. More importantly, she had proven that divine inspiration could triumph over seemingly impossible odds, that a teenage peasant girl could change the course of history through faith and courage. 25 years after her death, the Church declared her trial to have been invalid, and her condemnation unjust. In 1920, she was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. Today, she is remembered not just as the patron saint of France, but as a symbol of the power of faith to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Joan of Arc's story reminds us that heroes can emerge from the most unlikely places, and that the course of history can be changed by those who dare to believe in something greater than themselves. Her legacy continues to inspire people around the world who face their own seemingly impossible challenges. What do you think gave Joan the strength to persist against such overwhelming odds? Was it divine inspiration, unshakable faith, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the hills surrounding Santiago de Cuba as Colonel Theodore Roosevelt squinted through the sweltering heat haze of July 1, 1898. The Spanish-American War had brought him to this moment, leading the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, better known as the Rough Riders, in what would become one of the most famous charges in American military history. But the man who would become the 26th President of the United States was far removed from the sickly, asthmatic child who had once been told by doctors that he might not live to see his 20th birthday. The transformation of Theodore Roosevelt from a frail, nearsighted boy into the embodiment of American vigor and determination was a story of relentless self-improvement, unwavering courage, and an unshakable belief in what he called the strenuous life. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was born on October 27, 1858, in a 4-story brownstone mansion on East 20th Street in Manhattan. His father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., was a wealthy glass importer and philanthropist who embodied the best traditions of New York's merchant elite. His mother, Martha Bullock Roosevelt, was a Southern belle from Georgia whose family had owned a plantation before the Civil War. This combination of Northern industry and Southern aristocracy would profoundly influence young Theodore's worldview. From his earliest years, Theodore, or TD as his family called him, was a contradiction in terms. His body was weak, racked by severe asthma that often left him gasping for breath in the middle of the night. His father would carry him on long carriage rides through the city, hoping the movement would help him breathe. Yet despite his physical limitations, the boy possessed an insatiable curiosity and a fierce determination that would define his entire life. The Roosevelt family library became young Theodore's refuge and training ground. While other boys his age were playing in the streets, he was devouring books on natural history, military campaigns, and heroic adventures. His nearsightedness, so severe that he once failed to recognize his own father across a room, forced him to rely on his intellect and memory in ways that would serve him well throughout his life. But it was his father's advice that truly shaped Theodore's character. During one of the boy's particularly severe asthma attacks, Roosevelt Sr. sat beside his son's bed and delivered words that would echo through American history. "Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body. And without the help of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body." The gymnasium that Theodore Sr. built on the second floor of their mansion became the laboratory where young Theodore began forging himself into the man he would become. Day after day, despite his wheezing lungs and weak muscles, he lifted weights, performed calisthenics, and practiced boxing. The results were slow in coming, but Theodore possessed something more valuable than natural athletic ability. He had an indomitable will. The family's summers at their estate in Oyster Bay, Long Island, provided Theodore with his first real taste of the outdoor life that would become his passion. Here, surrounded by the salt marshes and woodlands of Long Island Sound, he began developing the skills that would make him one of America's greatest naturalists and conservationists. He learned to identify birds by their songs, to track animals through the forest, and to navigate by the stars. But it was during a family trip to Egypt when Theodore was 14 that his transformation truly began. While exploring the Nile Valley, he discovered that his poor eyesight was caused by severe myopia that could be corrected with glasses. The moment he put on his first pair of spectacles, the world exploded into sharp focus. For the first time in his life, he could see clearly, and what he saw filled him with wonder and determination. The experience of suddenly being able to see the world in all its detail was transformative. Theodore threw himself into the study of taxidermy, learning to preserve the specimens he collected during the family's travels. His bedroom became a natural history museum, filled with carefully catalogued birds, insects, and small mammals. This early scientific training would later influence his approach to politics and governance, teaching him to observe carefully, gather facts, and draw logical conclusions. When Theodore entered Harvard College in 1876, he was still a frail young man with thick glasses and an unusual intensity that made him stand out among his more conventional classmates. But his years of self-improvement had begun to show results. He joined the boxing team where his tenacity and refusal to quit earned him respect even from opponents who could easily defeat him. His academic performance was outstanding, and he began to develop the rapid-fire speaking style that would later make him one of America's most effective orators. It was at Harvard that Theodore first encountered the ideas that would shape his political philosophy. He studied under professors who emphasized the importance of public service and the responsibility of educated men to contribute to society. The concept of noblesse oblige, the idea that privilege entailed responsibility, resonated deeply with a young man who had been raised in comfort but taught to value hard work and moral courage. The death of his father during Theodore's sophomore year was a devastating blow that might have broken a lesser man. Roosevelt Sr. had been not just a parent, but a moral exemplar, a man who had devoted his wealth and energy to helping others. Theodore's response to this loss revealed the steel beneath his still developing exterior. Rather than retreating into grief, he threw himself into his studies with renewed vigor, determined to honor his father's memory through his own achievements. After graduating from Harvard in 1880, Theodore married Alice Hathaway Lee, a beautiful and intelligent young woman from a prominent Boston family. Their courtship had been intense and passionate, reflecting Theodore's characteristic approach to everything he did. He pursued Alice with the same determination he had applied to building his body and developing his mind, overwhelming her with his energy and enthusiasm. The young couple settled into a life of comfortable domesticity in New York, where Theodore began studying law while also working on his first book, The Naval War of 1812. This dual focus on legal and historical studies might have satisfied a more conventional man, but Theodore was already feeling the pull of public service. Against the advice of his family and friends, who viewed politics as a disreputable profession unsuitable for a gentleman, he decided to run for the New York State Assembly. The campaign of 1881 was Theodore's first real test in the arena of public life. His opponent was a seasoned politician backed by Tammany Hall, the powerful Democratic machine that controlled much of New York politics. Theodore, with his Harvard education and upper-class background, seemed like an unlikely candidate to appeal to the working-class voters of his district. But Theodore had underestimated the power of his own personality and the appeal of his message. He campaigned tirelessly, speaking at every opportunity and demonstrating a genuine concern for the problems facing ordinary New Yorkers. His youth, energy, and obvious sincerity struck a chord with voters who were tired of corrupt machine politics. When the votes were counted, Theodore had won by a comfortable margin. His 3 years in the New York Assembly were a political education that would serve him well throughout his career. He learned to work with men from all walks of life, to build coalitions across party lines, and to fight for reform without making unnecessary enemies. His investigations into corruption in the state government and his efforts to improve working conditions for laborers earned him a reputation as a reformer who could be trusted to put principle above personal gain. But personal tragedy struck just as Theodore's political career was beginning to flourish. On February 14, 1884, both his wife Alice and his mother Martha died on the same day, Alice from complications following childbirth, and Martha from typhoid fever. The double loss devastated Theodore, who wrote in his diary that the light has gone out of my life. Faced with overwhelming grief, Theodore made a decision that would define his character for the rest of his life. Rather than retreat into mourning, he chose to embrace what he would later call the strenuous life, a philosophy of constant activity, challenge, and service to others. He left his infant daughter in the care of his sister and headed west to the Dakota Territory, where he had already invested in a cattle ranch. The 2 years Theodore spent in the Badlands were transformative. The pampered son of New York society learned to rope cattle, hunt dangerous game, and survive in one of the harshest environments on the continent. He faced down armed desperados, tracked thieves across the prairie, and proved that his courage was not just physical but moral. When local ranchers wanted to lynch a man accused of theft, Theodore insisted on a proper trial, demonstrating that the rule of law must apply even on the frontier. The experience of frontier life also deepened Theodore's understanding of conservation and the relationship between humans and the natural world. He witnessed firsthand the destruction of the great buffalo herds and the impact of unchecked development on the wilderness. These experiences would later inform his conservation policies as president, making him one of the most environmentally conscious leaders in American history. When Theodore returned to New York in 1886, he was no longer the same man who had left. The physical transformation was obvious. Years of outdoor life had turned him into a robust, barrel-chested figure who radiated energy and confidence. But the mental and spiritual transformation was even more profound. He had learned that he could overcome any obstacle through determination and hard work, and he had developed an unshakable faith in the American people and their democratic institutions. His return to public life was marked by a series of increasingly important positions. He served as a member of the U.S. Civil Service Commission, where he fought to create a merit-based system for federal employment. As president of the New York City Police Commission, he walked the streets at night to ensure that officers were doing their jobs, earning the nickname Harun al-Theodore after the legendary caliph who disguised himself to observe his subjects. But it was his appointment as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897 that gave Theodore the platform he needed to prepare for the crisis he saw coming. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who believed that America could remain isolated from world affairs, Theodore understood that the United States was destined to become a global power. He worked tirelessly to modernize the Navy, convinced that sea power would be essential to America's future security and prosperity. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, Theodore was among the first to recognize that war with Spain was inevitable. While his superior Secretary of the Navy John D. Long was away from the office, Theodore used his temporary authority to cable Commodore George Dewey, commanding the Asiatic Squadron, with orders to prepare for action in the Philippines. But Theodore was not content to fight the Spanish-American War from behind a desk in Washington. Despite having a comfortable government position and a growing family, he had remarried in 1886 to Edith Kermit Caro, a childhood friend. He resigned his post to join the Army as a volunteer. This decision shocked his friends and family, who could not understand why he would abandon a promising political career to risk his life in what many expected to be a brief and relatively bloodless conflict. The answer lay in Theodore's fundamental belief that leadership required personal courage and that those who advocated for war must be willing to face its dangers themselves. "I have always believed," he wrote to a friend, "that words must be backed up by deeds, and that he who advocates a course of action must be prepared to follow it himself, regardless of personal cost." The first United States Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, which Theodore helped organize and would eventually command, was unlike any military unit in American history. The Rough Riders, as they came to be known, were a unique blend of Ivy League graduates, Western cowboys, Native American scouts, and former lawmen. What united this diverse group was not social background or military experience, but a shared belief in American ideals and a willingness to fight for them. Theodore's second-in-command was Colonel Leonard Wood, a professional soldier and Harvard-trained physician who had earned the Medal of Honor fighting Apache warriors in the Southwest. Wood recognized that Theodore's political connections and natural leadership abilities made him invaluable, even though he had no formal military training. The partnership between the two men would prove crucial to the regiment's success. The Rough Riders training camp at San Antonio, Texas, was a scene of controlled chaos as men from vastly different backgrounds learned to work together as a military unit. Theodore threw himself into the training with characteristic intensity, learning military drill, studying tactics, and getting to know each of his men personally. His ability to remember names, faces, and personal details impressed hardened veterans who had expected a pampered politician. But it was Theodore's willingness to share the hardships of military life that truly won over his men. He slept on the same hard ground, ate the same poor food, and endured the same brutal Texas heat as the lowest-ranking trooper. When supplies ran short, he used his own money to purchase equipment and food for the regiment. This kind of leadership by example would become a hallmark of his later political career. The regiment's departure for Cuba in June 1898 was marked by the kind of logistical confusion that characterized much of the Spanish-American War. The Army's supply system, designed for fighting Native American tribes on the frontier, was completely unprepared for overseas operations. Ships were overcrowded, food was spoiled, and medical supplies were inadequate. Theodore's organizational skills and political connections proved invaluable in cutting through military bureaucracy to get his men what they needed. The landing at Daiquiri, Cuba, was Theodore's first real taste of combat, and it nearly ended in disaster. The horses that had given the cavalry regiment its name had been left behind in Tampa due to lack of transport space, forcing the Rough Riders to fight as infantry. As Theodore waded ashore through the surf, carrying his rifle and wearing the Brooks Brothers uniform he had specially tailored for the campaign, he must have reflected on the strange turns that had brought him from the libraries of Harvard to the beaches of Cuba. The march inland toward Santiago was a nightmare of tropical heat, disease, and confusion. The jungle terrain was unlike anything the Americans had encountered, and the Spanish defenders, fighting on familiar ground, had every advantage. Theodore's men suffered from dysentery, malaria, and heat exhaustion, but their colonel pushed them forward with a combination of personal example and infectious enthusiasm. It was during the battle for the village of Las Guasimas that Theodore first demonstrated the leadership under fire that would make him legendary. When the regiment came under heavy Spanish fire and threatened to break, Theodore rode to the front of the line, completely exposed to enemy bullets, and rallied his men with a combination of profanity and patriotic rhetoric that would have been impossible to imagine from the Harvard-educated politician. "Are you afraid to stand up when I am on horseback?" he shouted at soldiers who were seeking cover behind rocks and trees. The sight of their colonel, seemingly oblivious to the bullets whining around him, shamed the men into action. They rose from cover and advanced, driving the Spanish defenders from their positions. But it was the charge up San Juan Hill on July 1, 1898, that would cement Theodore's place in American legend. The attack was part of a coordinated assault on the Spanish defensive positions surrounding Santiago, and success was crucial to the entire campaign. The Rough Riders were assigned to assault Kettle Hill, a strongly fortified position that commanded the approaches to the main Spanish lines. As the regiment formed up for the attack, Theodore addressed his men with words that captured the essence of his philosophy. "Gentlemen, we have come here to fight, not to discuss. When I give the order, we will charge up that hill and drive the Spanish from their trenches. Some of us may not return, but we will do our duty as Americans." The charge itself was a masterpiece of controlled violence. Theodore, mounted on his horse Texas, and carrying a revolver recovered from the USS Maine, led from the front as his men advanced up the slope under withering enemy fire. The Spanish defenders, seasoned veterans of colonial warfare, fought with skill and determination, but they could not match the fierce enthusiasm of the American volunteers. When a Spanish bullet killed Theodore's horse, he continued the attack on foot, his voice hoarse from shouting orders and encouragement. The sight of their colonel, his glasses glinting in the tropical sun as he climbed steadily toward the enemy trenches, inspired his men to superhuman efforts. The Spanish line broke, and the Americans swept over the crest of the hill in a moment of triumph that would be celebrated in American folklore for generations. The victory at San Juan Hill effectively ended Spanish resistance in Cuba. Within days, the Spanish fleet was destroyed, and Santiago surrendered. The Spanish-American War was over, and America had emerged as a world power. Theodore's role in the victory made him a national hero and launched him toward the presidency. But the real significance of Theodore's Cuban experience lay not in the military victory itself, but in what it revealed about American character and potential. The Rough Riders had proven that Americans from all backgrounds could work together effectively when united by common purpose. The war had also demonstrated America's capability to project power globally and to defend its interests far from home. Theodore's return to New York was marked by a hero's welcome that reflected the nation's pride in its new international status. He was immediately nominated for governor of New York, a position he won easily on the strength of his war record and his reputation as a reformer. His 2 years as governor were marked by progressive legislation that protected workers, conserved natural resources, and cleaned up corruption in state government. But it was his selection as William McKinley's running mate in 1900 that put Theodore on the path to the presidency. Republican Party bosses, who had grown tired of his reform efforts as governor, thought the vice presidency would be a harmless way to sideline him. They could not have been more wrong. When President McKinley was assassinated by anarchist Leon Czolgosz in September 1901, Theodore Roosevelt became the youngest president in American history at age 42. The transformation of the sickly child from East 20th Street into the leader of the world's emerging superpower was complete. Theodore's presidency would be marked by the same energy and determination that had characterized his entire life. He would trust bust monopolies, conserve millions of acres of wilderness, build the Panama Canal, and win the Nobel Peace Prize for mediating the Russo-Japanese War. But perhaps most importantly, he would use the presidency to articulate a vision of American greatness that combined military strength with moral purpose. The phrase "speak softly and carry a big stick," which became associated with Theodore's foreign policy, actually originated in his experience with the Rough Riders. He had learned that true strength came not from bluster or threats, but from the quiet confidence that comes from being prepared to back up one's words with decisive action. Theodore's legacy extends far beyond his specific achievements. As president, he proved that American democracy could produce leaders capable of competing with the crowned heads of Europe, that the United States could be both a world power and a force for justice, and that the American people could rise to meet any challenge when properly led. His conservation efforts alone would have secured his place in history. He established 150 national forests, 51 federal bird reserves, 4 national game preserves, 5 national parks, and 18 national monuments. His belief that natural resources belong to all Americans, not just the wealthy few who could afford to exploit them, reflected the democratic ideals that had shaped his entire worldview. But perhaps Theodore's greatest legacy was his demonstration that the strenuous life, a life of constant effort, moral courage, and service to others, was not only possible, but essential for American democracy. His example inspired millions of Americans to believe that they could overcome any obstacle through determination and hard work. The boy who had been told he might not live to see 20 became a man who lived life with such intensity that he seemed to pack several lifetimes into his 60 years. His advice to young Americans: far better it is to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to take rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much, because they live in the gray twilight that knows not victory nor defeat, remains as relevant today as it was a century ago. Theodore Roosevelt's transformation from sickly child to Rough Rider to president proves that in America, anyone can rise to greatness through courage, determination, and unwavering commitment to democratic ideals. His story reminds us that leadership is not about titles or positions, but about the willingness to face challenges head-on and to inspire others to do the same. Which aspect of Theodore Roosevelt's transformation do you find most inspiring? His physical transformation, his moral courage, or his ability to unite people from different backgrounds around common goals? Let us know in the comments below. These 3 remarkable figures, Marcus Aurelius, Joan of Arc, and Theodore Roosevelt, lived in different centuries and faced vastly different challenges. Yet their stories share common threads that illuminate the nature of true leadership and human courage. Each began their journey as an unlikely hero, a philosopher thrust into warfare, a peasant girl claiming divine visions, and a sickly child who willed himself to greatness. Marcus Aurelius teaches us that true strength comes not from the absence of doubt, but from the courage to act decisively despite uncertainty. His meditations, written in the quiet moments between battles, remind us that leadership requires constant self-examination and the willingness to place duty above personal comfort. The emperor who could have lived in luxury chose instead to share the hardships of his soldiers, proving that authentic leadership must be grounded in service to others. Joan of Arc's story demonstrates the power of unwavering faith and conviction. In an age when women were expected to remain silent and invisible, she had the courage to challenge not just enemy armies, but the fundamental assumptions of her society. Her willingness to die for her beliefs, rather than compromise them, reminds us that some principles are worth any sacrifice. More importantly, her ability to inspire others to believe in themselves and their cause shows us that true leadership often means helping others discover their own potential for greatness. Theodore Roosevelt's transformation from frail child to dynamic leader illustrates the American ideal of self-improvement and reinvention. His embrace of the strenuous life was not just personal philosophy but a blueprint for national greatness. He understood that democracy requires citizens who are willing to work hard, face challenges honestly, and serve something greater than themselves. His conservation efforts alone saved millions of acres of wilderness for future generations, proving that true leadership must consider not just immediate needs but long-term consequences. Each of these leaders faced moments when the easy path would have been to retreat, compromise, or abandon their principles. Marcus could have remained safely in Rome rather than campaigning on the dangerous frontier. Joan could have recanted her visions when threatened with death. Theodore could have remained a comfortable politician rather than risking his life in Cuba. Instead, each chose the harder path, and in doing so, they changed the course of history. Their stories also remind us that leadership is not about perfection but about the courage to continue despite setbacks and failures. Marcus struggled with the gap between his philosophical ideals and the brutal realities of imperial rule. Joan's military career was brief and ended in capture and execution. Theodore's political career was marked by both triumphs and defeats, yet each persevered, driven by a vision of something greater than themselves. Perhaps most importantly, these three figures demonstrate that true leadership transcends the immediate circumstances of one's time and place. Marcus Aurelius's writings continue to inspire leaders around the world. Joan of Arc remains a symbol of courage and conviction for people of all backgrounds. Theodore Roosevelt's vision of American greatness continues to influence national debates about conservation, foreign policy, and the role of government. Their legacies remind us that in every generation, ordinary people have the potential to become extraordinary leaders. The key is not special birth, superior education, or perfect circumstances, but rather the willingness to act on one's convictions regardless of personal cost. Whether facing barbarian invasions, foreign occupiers, or national challenges, these leaders show us that courage, integrity, and service to others are the foundations of lasting greatness. As we face our own challenges in the 21st century, we can draw inspiration from these timeless examples of leadership. Like Marcus Aurelius, we can strive to make decisions based on reason and moral principle, rather than emotion or self-interest. Like Joan of Arc, we can have the courage to stand up for our beliefs even when the whole world seems against us. Like Theodore Roosevelt, we can embrace the strenuous life and work tirelessly to leave the world better than we found it. The steel of their weapons may have rusted, and the stones of their monuments may have crumbled, but the legacy of these three remarkable leaders remains as strong as ever. They remind us that true greatness is not measured in wealth, power, or fame, but in the positive impact we have on the lives of others and the example we set for future generations. What qualities do you think are most important for leaders in our modern world? How can we apply the lessons learned from Marcus Aurelius, Joan of Arc, and Theodore Roosevelt to the challenges we face today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories from history that continue to shape our world today.